Thanks everybody for coming back after the coffee. I don't know if anybody made it all the way across to a Starbucks or something like that, but it's great that people are coming back for the first paper session of ICTD 2020. Thanks to the organizers for all the hard work and all the participants and all the authors for reconfiguring around a virtual conference. I think we're off to a really good start. A couple things I'll say. One, I'm Jonathan Donner, and I'm a researcher at a group called Caribou Digital. We've got 4 great talks today, and I want to make sure we spend as much time in the talks as possible. The talks aren't exactly all on the same topic, so I think for conversation, it is probably best if we take questions and commentary about each talk immediately after the talk, and then if we have a little bit of time left over for synthesis, we can do that at the end. But that means I'm going to try to hold speakers to 12 minutes or so. I'll warn at 15, and then I'll really warn if anybody goes over that so that we stay on time. In terms of interactivity, it's hard to do interactivity on a session like this, so let's do it this way, I think. Put your questions in chat and then signal if you want to be unmuted to ask yourself, or if you're happy to just have me read it. If we get overwhelmed by questions, then I'll have to just triage and read questions. If there's just a few, I'll actually unmute you, and then we can all pretend to be in the same room that way instead. That is and let's hold questions unless they're really pivotal to moving between a slide to the end of each speaker's time, and then we'll have a little conversation. So with that, I'm just going to introduce the first speaker, and I'll do it for each who comes after that. So our first speaker is Niall Keleher, and the paper is Connecting Isolated Communities, Quantitative Evidence on the Adoption of Community Cellular Networks in the Philippines.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. I'm going to get everything set up. Jonathan, can you just confirm that you're able to see my first slide?
Anybody else can go thumbs up if they can see it. Not yet. Are you sharing?
Not yet. Oh, I see. Okay. There's one additional step to take.
There we go.
Okay. Great. Well, thanks for the introduction, Jonathan. My name is Niall Keleher. I'm at Stanford University, and I'm really excited to be able to share work from the Philippines that several colleagues of mine at the University of Philippines, Diliman, UC Berkeley, University of Washington, and UC Davis have been working on for several years now. This is one paper of a much larger project that has several threads working on it. It's a great collaboration of social scientists and computer scientists, engineers, as well as others. And really, the motivation for this particular paper was the goal was to unpack what some of the determinants of cellular network adoption, with a focus on community cellular network in the Philippines. We leverage very rich, detailed socioeconomic survey data that we collected prior to the installation of cellular towers, and we're able to pair that with records from when the cellular network was actually launched, to look at what were the drivers, the determinants of which households use the network, and which sites were more effective than others. And I'll just note, this is work that we focus on the early stage adoption. We're not speaking to long-term viability of these community networks. It's really just focused on the first 5 months. So just to kind of overview our evidence, prior to the installation of the cellular networks, phone ownership was not universal, and we found that those who own phones tended to be wealthier than non-phone owners. Local information networks, offline social networks were much stronger than long-distance networks. People rely on people within their own CTO, their village in the Philippines terminology, for information, and rarely travel outside of their own CTO or local area. We show that these community cellular networks in 7 sites brought a marked increase in the connectivity, at least measured through their access to cell phone network signal. But we found large differences in take-up of that network across sites. We have very little evidence that previous phone ownership is a barrier to using the network. Instead, we show that really the key determinants and barriers to adopting the network and using the cellular network are measures of wealth and education. So just a kind of preview overview of the general research. We installed 7 new base stations in 7 locations on the coast of Aurora province on the island of Luzon in the Philippines. These are 2G networks that were installed and managed by community members. The University of Philippines did a lot of the technical backstopping, but really what's key to these networks is that there's community ownership and maintenance at the site level. This is a part of a randomized control trial where we had the 7 sites that were selected to receive a tower were selected because there were resource constraints to be able to install that number of towers. Part of a different paper, we're looking at the comparison of the 7 sites that received the tower to those 7 sites that did not receive the tower. So this particular paper, we focus on those 7 sites that did receive a tower installation, and we leverage baseline survey data to understand socioeconomic characteristics of households and adults that live within those households. The towers were phased in, so the 7 towers were installed at different points over about a 1.5-year period, which is also why we focus on just the first 5 months of adoption. And then part of other work, we leverage follow-up survey data collected in mid-2019. What we show is that about 2/3 of households had owned a phone at the time of our baseline survey. Again, phone ownership is not universal, as much as prior kind of suggestive terminology would have said that phone ownership and Facebook usage is widespread. I think we need to remind ourselves that this is not the case, and that those that do own phones tend to have greater wealth. These plots here are showing on the y-axis our estimate from the survey data of the wealth of the household. So these in red, on average, are the phone owners tend to be, on average, wealthier than those that are non-phone owners. We also show that those phone owners also are more connected to people outside of their community. They report that they're more able to communicate with a family member in case of an emergency. They report traveling outside of their barangay more frequently, and more frequently are more likely to have traveled to Manila in the preceding 3 years. We collected really detailed social network data as well. And what we find is that in contrast with these long distance social connectedness measures in terms of local kind of cohesiveness of people's offline social networks. Those who own phones are no more kind of central or connected than those who don't own phones. We measured the quality of the cell phone network signal after all of the towers were installed. We did this in both our treatment sites, those that received the tower, as well as our comparison sites. And what this plot is showing us is that each dot represents one particular household and a measure of the quality of the cellular network signal at their household. So again, this is after the cell phones were installed. And we show that those that are in the community cellular networks, CTOs, had a much greater likelihood of being able to make a phone call from their household as compared to those that were in the comparison sites. We can look at very disaggregated call records at the site level, and just kind of quick takeaway from this figure, we see large differences across sites. These are all presented in log scale. So site 2, we see that the usage was pretty consistently at about 1,000 transactions per day. And whereas sites 1 and sites 5 and 6 had virtually zero, very low usage for long periods of time. And kind of looked at the aggregate, we see that sites 2, 3, 4, and 7 had quite high usage. Site 2 being the largest, the most active site, and then these sites 1, 5, and 6 had quite low usage for all transactions. Some difference in the percentage of households that actually use the network, so that the lowest end, this site 5, less than 1/5 of households actually use the network, in contrast with site 2, where virtually every household made at least one call or sent at least one text message. When we look at household level take up, we don't see we don't see evidence that previous phone ownership was a barrier to using the network. About 2/3 of non-phone owners, this is again measured at baseline, so they would have found a phone after baseline when the network was introduced. About 2/3 of residents used the network for both phone owners and non-phone owners. And we don't see, in terms of volume, we don't see any significant differences there. We also in the paper present evidence from a multivariate regression analysis, and here we're trying to see controlling for several different socioeconomic factors, whether or not certain characteristics are highly correlated with the volume of usage. And here we find that wealth is highly correlated. We don't really, this is again just extra evidence of what we saw on the last slide, that we don't find a strong evidence of that previous phone ownership was a barrier. Social connectedness doesn't seem to be to be the main driver, and education, particularly when we're focused on the on text message usage, education seems to be highly correlated with the volume of usage. So in conclusion, we in this paper, we show evidence of highly successful community cellular network implementations. However, that wasn't the case at all 7 sites. There's kind of a high level of variance across sites. Previous phone ownership was not a barrier. One thing we also note in the paper is that female-headed households and agricultural households were early adopters. They were more likely to have actually used the network. But once we control for wealth, their usage is their volume of usage is not as high as others. And really, kind of this we think that this focus on wealth kind of really underlines the need to think about equity and how we're pricing the networks, and that's related to future research that we're planning. And that's connected to other papers that our team is working on, and then kind of feeding this back into how you plan for and scale up these community networks is also a key agenda item for our team. So I'll stop there. Jonathan, I don't know how we're doing for questions and time.
We're doing great on time, and we should open the floor to questions right now. Either raise your hand or drop it in chat if you've got a question you'd like to ask. And while we're gathering questions, I might just start with one, which is, you know, this kind of work touches so many sort of the policy discussions, and you've got to deal with sort of, you know, people in industry and MNOs. Now, how do you kind of reframe or talk about this work to broader audiences beyond the academy?
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan, for that question. So I think a lot of our focus in terms of talking to the policy audience is discussing how to serve that last mile, like and have the barriers have certainly been a constraint to reaching communities like these, and what we're focused on is showing that a lower cost technology than installing full-scale towers is sustainable, and that there is a clear unmet demand in these communities. Now, I think that's what part of our research is focused on, this element of how to make it accessible and setting the prices right, is where our research is kind of, we're trying to bring that to the policy conversation much more prominently, and because I think from this evidence and just the fact that these are very kind of new networks to install, there's uncertainty about the economic viability of them, and getting that pricing right, any subsidies from governments or international players to support the installation and the maintenance is another area where we're focusing our conversations.
Ashley, I can't, this is one of my Zoom problems here. Have you got a question as well? I've got and Nikki might as well. Nikki's got a question.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. This is maybe slightly on the broader context of the work. You mentioned that you're involved in an RCT. I'm interested in how, like, what you chose as outcomes for, you know, communities obviously that don't get access. Like, what are you actually measuring, and how you chose those outcomes? Like, what do you think is important to measure to try and understand how these networks are impacting communities? Yeah,
no, thanks, Nikki. So we set up and as part of the experimental protocols, we set up a pre-analysis plan, and that's posted publicly. I can share that link with anybody that's interested, where we work through kind of a causal chain of how do we go from community network installation to kind of the economic and social outcomes we're interested in. And so we kind of measured the network signal and access to communications in the treatment and control sites. And then we also kind of built that up by saying, like, okay, when you have, based off of our theory of change, that there's improved access to communications, we also expect that there should be some measurable change in people's social networks, and the quality of, let's just say, quality of information that they have, how informed they are about kind of cultural, social, and political activities in the Philippines. And then you can kind of think through the full logical model of going from there to access to information about jobs, migration, and then people's earnings. So we work through that in the whole our analysis plan, and by having both baseline and endline data in the network sites and the comparison sites, we can kind of compare what it was like before and after in absence or with the network towers.
Great, thanks. And I think we've got time for one more question. And Nicola nope, you all set? You're gonna do it later? Okay, because she's in the catbird seat because she gets to talk later, so she's gonna ask a question. So with that, thanks a lot. And you know, if we've got moments at the end, we'll try some connections between these different papers.